is going to be on digital ecosystems. The five of us have chatted a bit before this panel, and there's obviously a lot of, I think, interesting topics around competition and regulation that relate to digital ecosystems. So I think we have a lot to talk about. What makes me really excited about this panel are our panelists. I think we have folks who have spent significant time in their professional careers thinking about these specific issues and thinking about them from very different perspectives. So, for example, we have two panelists, both with significant agency experience, who sort of bring the agency regulatory perspective to some of these issues. So on my left here, we have Eric Dunn, who is the Assistant Chief in Competition Policy and Advocacy section at the DOJ right now in the antitrust section. So you can imagine Eric has been sort of on the front lines of many high-profile cases recently and is obviously thinking about these issues in real time. And then we have Noah Phillips, who was former commissioner at the FTC for 4 years, 2018 to 2022, again, seeing these issues real time from the agency perspective. He is now the co-head of Cravath's antitrust practice and thinking about these issues in private practice. And then we have the in-house perspective. So we have Katie Larkin-Wong. Katie is the Director of Competition and Litigation at DoorDash currently. She spent 3 years at Meta before that as Associate General Counsel, thinking about issues of competition, regulation, et cetera. So again, she's been sort of on the inside of a tech firm trying to think about antitrust risk in this context while advising her own business and thinking about from the internal perspective. And then lastly, no panel is complete without an economist. So,
self-serving much?
Done yourself, right?
So we need the economist, and of course, we have our good friend John Asker here. John is a professor of economics at UCLA, and both in his academic work, he thinks a lot about competition policy, issues like vertical restraints, exclusionary conduct, cartel theory, and he's also been an expert witness in a number of matters in the tech industry, thinking about these issues of digital ecosystems. So, really, my goal is to not get in the way and let the four of these folks talk about these issues from their perspectives. But just to tee up kind of our first topic, one of the things we wanted to talk about, which I think came up obviously in the AI panel as well, is sort of this trade-off between innovation incentives and scale, which I think is at the heart of a lot of the policy debates in big tech. And the biggest tech firms in the world, even the fiercest critics of big tech would acknowledge that firms like Google, Amazon, Facebook have brought innovation to the world. They disrupted markets through innovation. But that innovation allowed them to scale quite quickly. And once they reach scale, there's then this question of, from a regulatory perspective, does their scale as an incumbent flip those incentives? And might they then try to disrupt the incentives and get in the way of potential rivals that will innovate against them? And so this tension of wanting to ensure that innovation incentives are strong for future innovators as well, but also regulating the innovators who reach scale and become successful is at the heart of a lot of these debates. And so I'll start with John. Just curious if you could take a few minutes to kind of, in your mind, talk about some of the unique economics of technology markets, technology-driven products, particularly around incentives to innovate.
Sure. So, let me begin by very much being an academic and give you a sense of the intellectual history of this in economics. Ken Arrow, who was, almost by unanimous vote, the most influential economist, at least within academia in the 20th century, in 1964 put forward sort of the opinion that monopoly has a tendency to diminish the incentives for innovation. And many economists and much of the economic literature around innovation and market structure builds on that in various ways. But there's a tension there in that another notable economist, a guy called Joseph Schumpeter, in 42, made the empirical observation that when you look at the world, a lot of innovation is being done by the biggest firms. And so, the most interesting parts of the literature, and that part of the literature that I think most informs antitrust policy, is trying to reconcile these two, observations made by two very influential economists. And, I think where the literature is at the moment is, recognizing that there's some truth in both these statements, but that, as Brian points out, you got to dig a little deeper to understand in any given, fact situation how the incentives are being placed, shaped, and formed. And, I find it helpful to break this down, informed by people like Carl Shapiro and others, into a couple of things that are useful to look at. The first is that, when thinking about whether there are incentives to innovate and how strong they are, looking at just the contestability of the market is a really important thing. So while it might be that in a given point in time, the market may be dominated by a particular technology or a particular set of firms or something like that, the incentive for someone to come in and grab customers away from those more established firms is what I mean by contestability. Now, the second thing that's going to shape incentives is appropriability. To the extent you can pull people away, can you grab the value that your innovation is capturing? And so things like the relevant intellectual property regime is important in that regard. The kind of competitive moves that other firms in the industrial ecosystem can make are going to be important in that regard. A next element, which is very important in tech broadly for shaping innovation, is the influence of the ecosystem and complementarities. And I think this, in many parts, is what distinguishes what we call tech from much of what we're more familiar with dealing with in widget industries and so on. So, a complement is a product or service which enhances the value of that which I'm selling. Something that's really interesting about tech is that the evolution of what's a complement moves real fast. So if we were sitting here in 2021, I don't think anyone would take me seriously if I said that nuclear power generation might be a complement to cloud computing, right, or AI. But that's the world we live in. Some of these complements are such that the force of the complementarity increases with the number of users. Loosely speaking, that's often referred to as a network externality. So it's this interaction of market structure having some influence, but it being subtle. The influence of complements and the fact that the nature of all of this is moving fast is important for, I think, understanding the interaction between unambiguously, in many instances, high costs of actually coming up with innovation and your ability to be incentivized to undertake those upfront fixed costs and hopefully deliver something of value. There's one other bit, I think, which is important for thinking about policy with respect to tech, which is obviously tech isn't the only thing where innovation is important. But it's part, I think, of the fundamental difficulty that we have with tech is that it moves real fast. See my earlier comment relating to nuclear power plants. And also, it takes some technical proficiency to understand what on earth is actually going on, right? We're very familiar with a car and the fact a car has a steering wheel, a chassis, and some seats, and maybe an engine. Understanding what's actually going on inside a mobile phone or a computer or a silicon chip is a complicated thing, and it's not something we have a lot of familiarity with as everyday consumers. And in particular, that means that explaining this to a jury or a judge is just an added layer of complexity on top of these difficult conceptual economic issues.
Thanks, John. I want to turn to Eric next for the DOJ perspective, the regulatory perspective. Obviously, you all are grappling with some of these issues that John lays out with large tech firms and thinking about maybe perhaps conduct that could, stem innovation, and you need to think about how you're going to bring cases, how you're going to regulate these issues, and just sort of a window into how you all think about balancing these innovation incentives.
Sure, thanks. And John started by playing the role of the academic. I will start by playing the role of the government attorney and say that the views expressed here are my own views and don't necessarily reflect the views of the Department of Justice or the Antitrust Division. So, we're talking about scale and innovation. I think it's important to think about what we mean by scale. That can mean a lot of different things in different cases. It comes to digital platforms. Sometimes scale means data, and you might be talking about a market where, because you're either a dominant platform or just a large platform, you've acquired a lot of data about how users interact with the platform, and that can feed into improving an algorithm and making the product better. And you sort of see that reinforcing cycle as you get more data, better product, more users, and on that cycle spins. You can think about scale as, in a marketplace, a two-sided marketplace where you have, customers and folk, let's say like an app store where you have people who are trying to buy an app and people who are trying to sell an app, and you have the platform that's sort of intermediating that. You can think about scale as, well, I've attracted a lot of users and I've attracted a lot of app developers, right? And that can be sort of a barrier to entry for somebody who might be trying to enter that market. This is the chicken and the egg problem that the DC Circuit talked about in Microsoft. So I think it's important to first kind of start by defining what you mean by scale, and I think that's important to think about what potential problems you might see in a market because of scale. I think the other point I will make at the outset is scale, I don't think it's inherently good or bad. I think it's just a reality of markets. And to John's point, it's something that you have to think about when you're approaching, is there a potential problem in this market? You need to think about, well, what is the role that scale is playing? And it may be innocuous, and it's not, let's say, a barrier to entry. It may be playing an important in the way that competition is happening or not happening in a market. So, when could scale raise concerns from, I'll push back on the regulatory perspective and say from an enforcement perspective.
Yep.
You could think about scale as a potential barrier to entry that potential rivals might not be able to overcome. This is something the DC Circuit talked about in Microsoft. You can think about scale as enhancing the effect of anti-competitive conduct. So, right, if you have conduct that's giving you a certain amount of market share, but that creates that reinforcing flywheel, then conduct that maybe is potentially anti-competitive or is raising concerns, you can see that over time, because of realities of the market related to scale, that can create sort of reinforcing effects. And so conduct that might, in kind of the beginning of a life cycle of an ecosystem, maybe not raise concerns. As you're assessing it, one of the realities you should think about is, well, if this plays out and this company continues to use this conduct to exclude rivals, which is part of the competitive process often, but what they're doing because of that is getting more and more scale, and eventually that will create sort of an insurmountable advantage or barrier. That's going to be something you're going to want to think about as you're developing a case or investigating in industry. Another important thing that I've alluded to is product quality and the role that scale, either in terms of data, network effects, or in any other way, that scale can sort of play into product quality. And so often when you're trying to understand in an industry, does a particular player, are they the dominant player, or they have the largest market share? Is that because they've engaged in conduct that's legitimately concerning, or do they just have the best product? And that's perfectly a legitimate way to acquire customers. And the story's not always that easy, because sometimes the folks with the best product quality may legitimately have the best product, but part of why they have the best product is because they've injured their competitors and prevented them from getting the kind of data or inputs that they would need to develop a competitive product. And so I guess the point there is, when you're thinking about potential concerns, it's not always easy enough to just say, well, that firm has the best product, and so we should walk away and not be worried about this industry. So those are sort of potential ways you might think about scale as being concerning. And I think it's important, I was trying to define what scale means. I think it's important when you're looking at industry to think about what the role that scale is playing in potential anti-competitive conduct, because that ultimately plays into what remedy you develop, But if you're thinking about how do I solve the problem, you have to understand what the problem is. And the remedy in a market where the scale that you're worried about or the anti-competitive conduct that's being accentuated is being accentuated because of data advantages versus network effects, those might be different. You might have different solutions that you want to either investigate or potentially seek either through a consent decree or through a case. And so I think the important thing, the nuance that John was getting at, it's both at the I need to think about if there's a problem here, and then it's also at the solving. It's at the remedy stage, thinking about, well, what's the potential solution? I think at the end of the day, can scale mean that companies are more innovative? Maybe. I think sometimes. I think ultimately, from at least my perspective, I think of as the best force for innovation is competition. When firms exist in competitive markets, when they are worried about competitive pressure, they are more innovative. And so what, at least for me, when I'm thinking about a case, what I'm worried about is not, well, is this company going to be, big, and because they're big, they're going to have more data, and maybe that does genuinely give them more insights or more ability to develop products. What I'm thinking about is what, the principles reflected in the laws that Congress has passed, which is we should be promoting competition, and competition in and of itself will drive firms to be more innovative, whether they have a lot of scale or not.
Thank you, Eric. Katie, just kind of curious, we can kind of run with that from sort of the in-house perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few reactions that I have on scale. So the first is like from an investor and from an innovator's perspective, scale is success, right? Like, investors want to see scale from companies. Innovators want to, in some cases, want to scale, right? That to them is success. I should also say, let me also give a caveat that is similar to Eric. This is one place where in-house and the enforcers will get along, which is anything I say today does not necessarily represent the views of DoorDash. They're my personal views. And I'll say also that's a pure caveat for my former employers as well. But I think like one of the things that I see happening, and I think it's increased honestly during the current administration, is industry insiders and investors worrying about a regulatory regime where scale and therefore success in developing disruptive technologies is an antitrust problem, right? That is a problem we have to go solve. And so how do you think about that tension? And I think, John was talking about how we set it up from an economics perspective, but I do think, and you're hearing more of this just in general conversation around, is that just inherently problematic? And I think investors and innovators want to say no, that is not inherently problematic. Let me give you an example of what this might look like. So take Instagram, right? Currently, the FTC is challenging Facebook's, now Meta's, acquisition of Instagram, which they approved at the time. At the time that Facebook bought Instagram, it was 13 people and a photo sharing app, right? Today, Instagram has thousands of employees. They have an ads engine. They're backed by Facebook's infra. Now, you could argue certainly that Instagram would have gotten there on its own, right? And I think that's part of the argument that you're seeing the FTC assert in that case today. But another way to think about that is that's a successful integration and merger that brought more value to Instagram than would have been possible were it not for the M&A with Facebook. I actually worry more about chilling effects in much smaller instances. So we're talking a lot about big scale and big companies, but I want to go back a little further because there are many innovators whose goal actually isn't scale. Their goal is to make a product that works well enough for it to be complementary to somebody who does have scale. And their goal is to sell that product and then move on to their next innovation. And if we continue to think about, gaining scale or adding a complementary product to a scaled business as an antitrust problem, we may actually chill those innovators. And we will chill their investors. who worry about, like, will I be able to sell this business over the long term? Will I be able to get ROI? And so that, I think, is a problem that we are going to have to continue to grapple with, and a way that the way we think about scale could actually dampen innovation in smaller pieces of complementary products around some of these scaled businesses. The last thing I'm going to say, and I just want to kind of shift a little bit, is how we think about competitive landscapes in these tech markets, I think, is important and challenging just across the board. You've got to, and my teams internally look at innovation across their supply chains, right? So they're looking at all sorts of ways that technology could be disruptive. You're seeing this with AI right now. Certainly, we heard a lot of that in the prior panel. But the ways that AI is going to disrupt not just tech, but lots of industries, we don't know yet. Like, we just fundamentally don't know. And even the people who are working on it today don't really know. But I don't think you have to look at AI to really understand this concept. In prep for the panel, we were talking a lot about, like, what if you looked at music, right? You look at cassettes to CDs to MP3s. That's certainly an important move. Those are important moves for the music industry, but they came about, especially CDs to MP3s, because of compression models that weren't designed for the music industry, but they came into the music industry and fundamentally disrupted it. And so I think one of the things that's happening with tech here is that there are things that are being developed in different places that are going to come in and fundamentally disrupt those scaled businesses. And so one of the questions I think we have to keep asking, and it's a tough question for Eric and the government to deal with, is, like, where is the innovation going to come from, and what is the disruption going to be? And it may not be from those scaled players. It may be from something that is outside of that scaled business. AI developed in research, right? It started in research, and it's now being commercialized. And so where will that innovation, where will that disruption come from? I think it's not that simple in tech. And moreover, to John's point, because it's moving so fast, whether the law can keep up with that is, I think, a really hard challenge.
I see Noah chomping at the bit.
I mean, right, AI powered by chips that were developed for video games.
Right.
Like, not necessarily what anyone, much less anyone in government, might have predicted. Let me begin with some of the caveats here. No, well, this is part of the, well, we'll get to that in a moment. So speaking, great to be here. Thank you, Brian, for hosting this, and thanks to TEC for hosting all of us. It's a real honor to be here with this panel. I'm just speaking for myself, not for Cravath or for its clients. I do think one of the more complicating issues that we face in tech writ large is most people, even most institutions with some level of outlook into the broader markets, haven't been terrifically good at predicting where competition is going to come from, right? I remember two instances in Congress, right? One instance where Mark Zuckerberg is sitting there in front of the Senate Judiciary Committee, and he's asked, are you a monopolist? Is Facebook a monopoly? It's Facebook at this point. And his response is, well, it sure doesn't feel that way. And right, that's a CEO, and he owns the company, and he's repping his book. But also, right, there's probably a truth to that in the sense that the company really does see a lot of threats, not necessarily coming from products that look exactly like its product. So if you look at the market definition in the case that you mentioned, it wouldn't include TikTok. And I don't think it's credible at this point in history to argue that Meta and others aren't looking at TikTok as a kind of competitive threat. Certainly, they are innovating, they're trying to mimic, they're doing all those things that you might do. And I guess this gets me to a point where maybe we can thread the needle a little bit between Arrow and Schumpeter. Not all monopolies, such as they are, behave in the same way, right? Your local utility may not be as innovative as Xerox was when they had Xerox PARC, or AT&T was when they had the Bell Labs. Like, those may have been monopolies, but they were innovative. They were really innovative. There is an argument that we would have seen more innovation had there been lower barriers to competition, had there been more rivalry, right, in markets. That's an argument, but I don't know that it's entirely settled. And I do think we have to grapple with the fact that sometimes at least scale, if not monopoly, and we have to think about and talk about how to define monopoly in this context, and it's harder, but at least scale does really facilitate a lot more innovation, at least in some instances. So luckily, now that I'm in private practice, I don't think I have to grapple quite as much with these, no pun intended, but meta questions about the world. One of the things I have to do is try to think about business conduct, transactions in terms of advising clients, both clients who are seeking enforcement from the government and clients who are anticipating that they might get an enforcement or defending against that enforcement or looking to get a deal cleared through the agencies. And I think one of the things we know is that the government right now certainly doesn't view at least M&A as really meaningfully contributing to innovation. That's a hard story to tell the agencies, and certainly a harder story than it used to be. To be clear, if that's part of your story, and it often is, it's a story that you do want to tell. And you certainly hope that it's backed up by the evidence and the documents that you're showing the government. Trying to figure out where, kind of, again, this meta debate that we've been having is going to make a difference, where the government is going to be more concerned about innovation competition, is sometimes very easy. You know, if you've got, I don't know, Google or Meta making a large acquisition, that's one of the tires that's going to get kicked. I don't think it's rocket science to say that. Demonstrating on the flip side, no, this is going to lead to innovation and how, might be a harder challenge even than saying, look, you're going to lose because you just don't have that good case to start off with. And certainly, the government is unlikely to take at face value the notion that there exists Schumpeterian competition or resolve doubt in favor of the notion that, well, we don't know where the innovation is going to come from, but we assume that it will come. I don't think that's the walking-in assumption, even if you've got anecdotes to support it, that sort of thing. And I think that's kind of part of the challenge.
Can I just offer just two thoughts in response to, Katie, you were talking about sort of scale as success. I think that's fair. I think you can also talk about market share as success, and yet, and we have a long history in the antitrust laws under Section 2 that just having a lot of market share is not in and of itself illegal, but paired with conduct that's helping reinforce that market share in ways that violate the antitrust laws, that is a problem. And so we also have well-developed case law that firms who have a lot of market share play by a different set of rules than firms that don't have a lot of market share. There are courts, just to sort of paraphrase, right? There are certain things a monopolist can't do that firms without monopoly share can do. And so I think it's not an unfair analogy to say there are things that firms with lots of scale, even if they got that scale through legitimate success, may not be able to do that firms with less scale can do. On the the innovation of the Xerox as an innovative monopolist, certainly that happens. I'm not saying it never happens. I think to get back to the competition point, I think Xerox is an interesting example, and there are others of innovation being developed within large companies where that innovation is not always commercialized or it doesn't always make its way to the market. And sometimes that's an intentional effort. You have monopolists who are quite innovative at developing basic research or new technology, but they don't always bring that technology to consumers until they face real competition. We've seen recent examples of this, I think, with AI, but there are other historical examples of this too. And so I think, to get back to my point about competition, what I think is so valuable about when innovation occurs in response to competition is ultimately that's innovation that is responsive to consumer preference, not the preference of large companies. And I think that's, when you're talking about innovation, it's not all created equal. Ultimately, I think in our economy, we should want innovation. We should want an economy that's responsive to consumer demand and consumer preference. And we should ideally want innovation that reflects that. And there's the joke about if I had asked folks what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. So it's not perfect. It's not always perfectly responsive to consumer demand and consumer preference. There's real genuine and disruptive innovation that happens. But I think on the Xerox point, I would say not all innovation is always created equal. They're good points, but that's just
We do want to talk a little bit about, obviously we're talking about scale and monopolies, but the other key word here is ecosystems, right? And so I think Noah's comments really got to this. When Amazon started as a online book retailer, people probably didn't envision that they would then be streaming content 20 years later and showing live NFL games on a streaming platform. So these large firms innovate in one product area, and then there's these complementarities, and they may then innovate in other areas. And these large firms can spur innovation in complementary markets. But this creates a problem. How do we think about what is the product market? That sort of haunts a lot of these big monopoly cases. You're trying to claim under the traditional machinery of the Sherman Act that a firm has a monopoly in a given product market. Well, what's the product, right? That is actually a complicated question for a lot of these firms. And that's given rise to sort of a lot of, I think, thinking about leveraging theories, tying theories, conglomerate theories. There are these new theories of harm around scale being used in one product market to potentially harm competition in other related products. So that's sort of, I think, the next topic we wanted to dig in on. And I kind of want to start with Katie on this one and just, again, sort of the in-house perspective on how you sort of manage this issue.
Yeah, so I was thinking as Eric was talking about market share, like, oh, in what market? Because I think that's one of our biggest challenges, right? And if I'm completely honest, when I talk to my business partners, and especially if you're in a regulatory engagement with the FTC or the DOJ or, CMA, EC, take your pick, market share is generally a big issue, although I will admit some of the changes to guidance and guidelines are working to perhaps make that less relevant. But I do think, for my business partners, it is often, that conversation is often one of the hardest, because what they hear coming out of regulatory agencies is product markets that simply do not fit the way that they think about the competitive dynamics that they face. To Noah's point, I don't think that Mark was being facetious when he said that's not how I see my competition, right? That's not the way I see myself or my business. And I think that's true for many of my business partners, which leads to a sometimes tough conversation in the sense that they feel like markets are being drawn in a way that doesn't reflect the competition that they face every day. And sometimes some, kind of concern that the agencies may be drawing markets that create market power versus the actual competitive reality that my teams face. So let me take an example of this, because I think there's also an innovation layer that comes on top as these markets continue to move, no matter how you draw them. So ads, why not? Hot topic. One, Eric can't talk about too much, so we'll stay light on it. But I think, look, ads is a topic that we've been talking about for more than a decade now, right? In terms of what does the shape of that market look like? And you've had lots of regulatory agencies who have been trying to, through market studies or otherwise, better define the contours of an ads market. Frequently it gets talked about as search ads, i.e. Google, and or display ads, which are more typically associated with Meta and today TikTok. I think the question then becomes, are those separate markets, or do they compete with one another in one bigger market, and maybe along with TV, radio, et cetera? For many of the business partners that you talk to in ads, what they will say is, I am competing for an overall budget, and I want as much of that budget as I can get. Now, my differentiator in that market is what I can bring to them, but I don't view that as a separate market. I don't view them as being independent. I think the agencies have generally taken a different view, and I think that's true kind of globally at this point. But then I think you layer innovation on top of it, and I think it gets a little more complicated. I think there's a legitimate question about whether that division between search and display continues to be true today. IG would be very happy to be the product through which I find my children's Halloween costumes this year. top of mind for me at the moment. You know what?
Have
Google
some tips.
Google would be too. I found them, thankfully.
That's the next one.
Google would be too, right? Both companies want to be the ones to provide me that connection to the company where I ultimately buy my children's Halloween costumes. Now, 5 years ago, maybe the searches in those two places might have looked very different. But I will tell you that my search on Google today for Halloween costumes, I bet looks very different. The results look very different than a GW student who is searching for Halloween costumes today on Google. I'm quite certain that what I get served, right? What I get served looks more like kids' costumes, and what they get served is probably closer to Tipsy Elves. Now, all of this is to say, query whether there has been like innovation on both sides of that. And I think, by the way, you could probably make the same argument on display. Like, has innovation resulted in kind of those two markets, as they are currently defined by the agencies, getting closer to one another today? And I think this is just an example of the problems we are going to have to continue to grapple with. But I will tell you, for many, to answer Brian's original question, for many folks, when I'm talking to my business partners, the markets that are frequently being defined are not ones that they feel like accurately represent the competition that they are facing every day.
Thank you, Katie. So, John, you've had the fun of trying to define a market as an economist, an expert witness. Maybe you can talk a little bit about how you sort of grapple with the existing machinery, the existing case law when you're in a complicated market like this with complementarities.
Yeah. So let me back up just a little bit, and I see a lot of the tension broadly around market definition here between sort of a desire to sort of think, if you will, in the cross section, right? At this point in time, there are X number of firms doing something like this, versus a different view, which is over the course of some reasonable span of business planning timing, there's an evolution or a dynamic that looks like this, and that's what's providing the essential rivalry to the market. Now, as the testifying economist, often what you find yourself in the position of doing is trying to come up with a reasonable way to view the market that allows you to talk to what you see as the essential elements of competition, which is at the end of the day where the rubber hits the road. Now, particularly in the US, within that context, I see product definition as becoming more important than I would have expected 10 or 15 years ago. I think there's a couple of reasons for that. The first is there's just a bunch of cases being brought that, in one way or another, have some kind of tying theory at the bottom of them. And for that to get off the ground, you need two distinct products. I think the US, there's a bit more of this because of refusal to deal doctrine. In other jurisdictions where that doctrine is not well established, there's, it feels to me like cases that I've seen have more of an essential, facilities flavor to them. And, so it's not quite essential, but at least in North America, I see a trend towards this being a really important part of the overall sort of terms of engagement between the parties. And, the economist has a real role in this. Now, in structuring the testimony and just coming up with your conclusions about how to package everything so that the competitive reality can be communicated, defining the relevant products is super important for market definition. But I think it almost raises to a slightly higher level of importance because it runs through the entire competitive narrative all the way to remedy. Let me just unpack that a little bit. Often what I see testifying economists do is really put emphasis on the demand characteristics of the market in defining, whether they conclude that a product is distinct from some other item. There's good reason for that. First, that as economists, unambiguously, diversion between products is important for thinking about substitutability. And for things to be different, there needs to be some kind of substitutability or some kind of, sense in which these things are in different competitive settings. So understanding demand characteristics is useful. But at the same time, if you dig a little deeper and think about the task you're actually trying to do, what you're trying to do at the end of the day is to say, absent the conduct or in a competitive setting, are the demand characteristics such that it would be efficient for firms to deliver the product separately? That's important, because otherwise you get to the situation where, because there's one person in the world who doesn't have a right foot and they have demand for left foot shoes on their own, there is some demand for just left shoes and not right shoes, so therefore left and right shoes are separable. No one's ever going to bring a case and expect to be taken seriously where left and right shoes are distinct products. We buy them together for good reason. Similarly, if we're doing a merger of cars, we don't think about the steering wheel being separate from everything else, even though there is an aftermarket for steering wheels. So that, when you're thinking about what's a distinct product, something I like about the economics here that I think is really important is that it forces you to think hard about what the but-for world is, because that's telling you, what are the different products, and importantly, it's telling you how firms are going to supply them, and it's focusing you immediately on essentially what's at the bottom of the controversy, which is, do we think the competitive conditions are better absent whatever the conduct at issue is? That, of course, also means that the liability part of the case can then be linked to and engaged with at the remedy stage as well. And so, having in my view, having a principled economic approach to product definition helps you build the architecture that means that at every point in the case, you've got a coherent way to talk about competitive harm and, importantly, remedy. I always hesitate to offer, I never offer a legal opinion, but I can offer an economist's reading of legal writing. I don't think anything I've said is particularly controversial from the point of view of Jefferson Parish, for instance, right? It seems, at least to me, consistent with the ratio in that matter. The problem with being a testifying economist as opposed to an academic is that when you're on the stand, you actually have to have a basis for something and prove it in facts, right? And
So challenging.
As all of us, I think, have said, one of the challenges in these industries is when they're moving fast, in contrast to recorded music, when we can look at, say, LPs into cassettes into CDs, in some of these industries, if it's only been around for half a nanosecond and we're not even sure what the AI is useful for, right, it can be that much harder to form a factual basis, to form a conclusion one way or the other as to what a product market might be. In Eastman Kodak, the court correctly, fairly obviously, pointed to the fact that if you've seen the things being sold separately, that's pretty dispositive. The caution here is that the evolution of complementarities may be fast enough that even that evidence you need to interrogate to make sure that it's relevant to what you think the present day and the reasonably near future looks like. also you may be in the uncomfortable position of not having 30 years of data to look back on to see exactly how consumers are choosing things. So it's, I think recognizing the reality of the fact that it's hard to prove stuff is important. At least having a little bit of humility about what you can and can't do is useful. But at the same time, unfortunately, the poor judge has to actually make a decision. And so thinking about how you can, best explain what the landscape of the economic evidence looks like and what you can and can't conclude from it, it is as much a challenge as coming up with conceptually what the test should be.
Thanks, John. Eric, I saw you taking some notes during this discussion. I'm curious just for your thoughts on this sort of product market definition leveraging type topic.
Yeah, I think, having worked on a lot of cases involving digital platforms, this is probably the hardest, or one of the hardest issues, is thinking about, market definition, basically. And, there's a lot of good case law on market definition is not an end to itself, right? The idea is you're trying to kind of find a nexus where there is meaningful competition and it might be harmed. But realistically, defining a market is an expectation that most courts have. And I think it's a really big challenge because the merger guidelines talk about thinking about competition in platforms. You can think about competition on the platform, you can think about competition between platforms, and you can think about disruption that comes from somewhere else and disrupts the platform. And I think that paradigm, that kind of the possibility of disruption is something that we see play out a lot, right? I mean, we talked about the music market, right? This is what Microsoft was afraid of with browsers, right? It was afraid that browsers would in some way disintermediate the operating system that Microsoft had and sort of eventually lead to some kind of new computing paradigm, which more or less it did. And right, they wanted to stop that. And how do you intersect that with market definition? It's very hard because when you're thinking about defining a product market, you do have to appreciate that sometimes competition comes from left field. Sometimes competition comes from somebody who it seems like what they're doing is competing on the platform, but actually over time they really are disintermediating the platform operator and posing a real threat to the platform itself in the kind of way that browsers did. How do you reconcile that with market definition principles? In the DC Circuit, Microsoft argued that it was more or less unfair for the government to say the harm story in this operating system market is how Microsoft targeted browsers. But oh, by the way, browsers are not in the relevant market, and Microsoft's a monopolist. And the DC Circuit said that's fine and that's consistent. But I think that creates a challenge for when you're thinking about either defining markets or just trying to understand how industry dynamics are going to evolve. The CD analogy is interesting. I think there's a lot of interesting examples of this. You can think about iTunes existing on the Windows operating system and sort of seeding ground for the next computing paradigm. With mobile phones, I think at the end of the day, as many folks on this panel have either said or I am almost certain would agree, you can't really perfectly predict the future. And that's a really hard position to be in. You were talking about the judge has to make a decision if you're an enforcer thinking about having to bring a case. It's not quite the same, but it is, at the end of the day, somewhat similar that you're trying to make a concrete decision about whether to bring an enforcement action. And I think when you're doing that, when you're thinking through that, to John's point, there's a certain amount of humility that you have to have about your ability to predict how a market might play out if you do or do not intervene. And I think that humility it's just important to keep that in mind given the realities of how disruption sometimes plays out in markets. I think at the same time, you were talking about the advertising market, which to your point I will stay away from, but in general, in these cases you often hear, similar to Mr. Zuckerberg, that, boy, it sure feels like in this market I face a lot of competition, and you really ought to zoom out, and this market is, it's super macro, it's all widgets that even look like this or that we even think about when we're trying to make decisions. And I think, one way to kind of thread the needle, or at least the way I would think about it in these cases, is you can have multiple markets. It may be true that sometimes when you're making a decision at a macro level, and there are some products out there that you are thinking about, and maybe you are worried about TikTok or some other large platform potentially entering, your industry. I think from my perspective, how I would think about, is that something, as I'm thinking about defining a potential market and bringing a potential case, I would think about not, have you ever thought about, TikTok or whatever that product is? The question really is that product as it exists, or as it might develop in the future, realistically imposing constraints on how you might exercise monopoly power or market power if you have it? And that's really, I think, the important question in thinking about market definition. There's the sort of economics perspective, obviously, but just my own perspective and how I'm thinking about it is the story. Well, we think about that product sometimes is not as compelling as if we tried to do this bad thing that you're worried about, we wouldn't be able to get away with it because of either the constraints imposed by this other product, or this company, or the potential innovation or the innovative response that they might have. And I think it's not often that we hear that story, and the story we often hear is we think about that widget sometimes, and so it ought to be in the market, and you got to take this macro view, and that's less compelling.
Yeah. Noah, you want to
Sure.
weigh in?
So sort of to kick off where Eric stopped, I do think the easier hypothetical is you think about that product sometimes. I think the more difficult hypothetical is we think about that product all the time, right? And the debate actually is we've got this narrower definition of the market that we want to push. Whatever the other company, the other firm is outside of that, but they actually, the firm that's inside really is looking out to that and does see the competition coming from there. I agree with you completely. Ultimately, the question is is whatever that other firm is doing eliciting a competitive response, right? Is it constraining you, whether it's on price or quality, on innovation, you name it. I think I don't want to speak for Katie because Katie hasn't spoken, but I think we all agree you have to do it. Right? You have to define markets, among other things, because judges expect it, among other things, because this is a critical part of what the agencies are looking at. I think one of the notable things to me about the new guidelines is, while I think they absolutely do agree with all of the other ways to look at a lessening of competition in the context of mergers, because that's what the guidelines apply to, by lowering the thresholds, they really do add increased emphasis on market definition. And so this is effectively a greater part of the exercise than what I think the 2010 guidelines were trying to accomplish, which is more of a focus on unilateral effects. And I do think on average over time, and I think Eric was kind of describing this, although I don't want to put words in his mouth, you're often hearing the Schumpeterian story, the competition from the outside or the competition in the future that we can't anticipate, from defendants than you are from the government. Because if it's a challenge, especially in tech, but if the government can adequately define markets, if they can do the hypothetical monopolist test, if they can apply brown shoe, right, they may be able to win, right? That's however you feel about the case, and I know you can't talk about it. In US versus Google, there is a judge looking carefully at the facts presented in front of that judge. They are accepting certain market definitions, and they are rejecting others, right? They are doing the homework. But at the end of the day, however cramped someone might feel the market definition, that's how they're doing the analysis. Whereas this story about, and I don't mean to say story in the sense of it's fiction, but just what you sometimes hear from people, and is often true, that there really is competition outside, or this is a context where you can more reliably predict that there will be competition constraining us in the future that we can't show you today. That's in general, on average over time, going to favor the defendants because they want to tell a story of more constraints on whatever conduct that they're doing.
Yeah, it's just a quick response on that, because I think it's fair, obviously, that the argument that competition is coming from anywhere, right, obviously often comes from the defendants. But I mean, that's part of the story that the government told at Microsoft. And so it is, I do think that from the enforcement perspective, you do sometimes think about that when you're thinking about, should I be worried about this conduct? You are trying to think about, best you can, that progression from cassettes to CDs and onwards to MP3s and beyond, right? You're trying to think about if the market proceeds in that way that I might not anticipate, there's a set of competitive effects that might actually be concerning, that if I take a narrow view of the market, might not be.
So 100% agree with that. I think, earlier we were talking about this tension between innovation and scale and so forth. And one obvious place to look for problems is like, okay, where are the monopolists that aren't innovating, right? Now, sometimes those might be legal monopolies and that sort of thing, but that is a context where you might be more likely to spot the harm than the context where folks are innovating. I agree that the government looks at that. I think the government should be looking at that. I do think one of the debates, not that we're having, but that's being had more broadly, is over to what extent government intervention is going to foster the innovation that I think, like everybody wants competition, everybody wants innovation. I think now, certainly from my former agency, there seems to be a prevailing belief that whatever the intervention, it will support competition and innovation. I don't know that that follows as a logical matter. Everyone agrees we should do whatever the right amount of enforcement is that will get us to the competition and get us to the innovation. The real question is, like, is that always what we're doing?
I think that's fair.
Yeah, I'm hesitant to launch into a new topic. We have about 15 minutes left, but do John or Katie, anything to add to this final discussion?
I mean, I just think generally, like the recurring theme that is running through this entire panel, whether you're talking about scale or you're talking about market definition, is this concept of how fast everything is moving. And I think that is an inherent challenge for an enforcer. Right? Like many people argue by the time that the Microsoft case went to trial, it was irrelevant. Right? And I think that will continue to be a challenge here. And I'll come back to AI for a second. 2 weeks ago, I spent a bunch of time in Napa Valley at the Information's Women in Tech and Finance conference. That conference is solely dedicated to women, but it's a bunch of like investors and people who are working in both tech, finance, and media. And the conversation there, like what investors are really excited about is the opportunity for AI to disrupt all kinds of things, right? Things we haven't even imagined yet. So for example, one of the investors in Glossier was talking about, I am so excited about the opportunity to have personalized everything. Like, I don't want to open Google anymore and have a blank search page. I want to open Google and have it be responsive to me personally. I want Glossier to be serving me things that are based on my preferences and my interests. And so the opportunity to personalize things, I think, is something that people are really excited about. At the same time, right, at that conference, we heard from one of the co-founders of Anthropic who said, like, openly, we just don't know where this is going to go. We don't know all the potential use cases. And I think you heard that reflected in the first panel today as well. And so I think part of the challenge that is going to be really hard for all of us, whether you are a defendant or an enforcer, is like, where are any of these markets that we can define going, and where is the disruption coming from? And so while I realize that's kind of taking us back to where we started, I just think it's going to be a very inherent challenge that we are going to face. And I do think it feels to me more, it feels harder at this particular moment because of how much is changing and how quickly. And just because like some of the most disruptive companies out there are saying like, we can't even imagine all the use cases that will come because, literally we're releasing new models every quarter, and those new models have significant changes in what they can do. And so the question of how those will disrupt various industries is still very open.
I just have to say, my eldest, my daughter is 13, and her search page is all Glossier. So she's actually already there, whether it was designed by an AI or not.
But I do think it's interesting to think about, like, that's
right.
When you think about AI, you don't think like makeup. That was not the first thing. Like, that was not the first industry that comes to my mind when I think about what is AI going to disrupt. But investors are already there, and it's what they're thinking about and wondering, how can we take this to various industries that we are playing in. And I think that is just, to me, it was a signal of like where things are going to go, because right, it's where the money's going to come from. And so, just realistically, I think it's interesting. I'll also add that like the more personalized things get, like we've seen various theories of harm from the agencies in the past around personalization, both on the competition and on the consumer protection side. Data theories of harm, I think, will continue to be a huge issue as we move forward. So, I think one of the open questions that sometimes gets asked, and Brian, I don't want to take over your role, but is kind of like, are antitrust laws equipped to handle these new industries? I got to be honest, like, I feel like there's theories that still fit. It's just we're applying them to different markets, and that's not anything new for any competition lawyer or economist, for that matter.
I think that question has been asked over and over again throughout history since. No, I don't mean that in a dismissive way. I kind of think that's what makes antitrust so interesting.
Yeah.
A lot of the time, as new industries develop, there's both this fundamental question and the applied question of, okay, and how are we going to do it?
Mm-hmm.
Right, but it seems incongruous that we have the Surface Transportation Board, but we don't have the Internet Communications Commission. Now, for good reason.
I was going to say.
But
are you proposing a policy proposal?
And what I might have just done is suggested more something about the Surface Transportation Board. But it is interesting to think about competition policy in a broader rubric away from the cut and thrust of federal court and the design of the architecture that we use to regulate the different bits of the economy, recognizing the joint role that we have of the broad-based sort of Sherman Act, Clayton Act structure, which I think at least is as broad kind of rules of the game that apply everywhere in the economy. And then the more targeted industry-specific regulators that have some joint public interest and competition role, right? And it's, I don't think the North America is really the leader in this. I think this debate is much stronger in Europe as to how to handle this stuff. But looking forward, looking at the uncertainty and innovation that's going to happen on the regulatory side, I think this is an important part of the global landscape. But I note that the one thing we haven't touched on is the interaction between jurisdictions so much, but it's inescapably part of the landscape. And it's, there are a number of interesting, litigation ecosystems that are simultaneously being played out in Europe, in India and Brazil, in North America. And, it's hard to tell at times which one of those venues matter more, particularly as, some of these economies have a hell of a lot more people in them than the US does.
Yeah.
One of the things that I have found fascinating in watching the development, not just of the debate, but of the laws in some of these jurisdictions and some of the proposals here in the US for laws, is oftentimes what the laws effectively say is, you, platform, monopoly, whatever, you don't innovate until I say it's okay. But you guys over there are okay to innovate. And that's a really interesting take on how we have a pro-competition policy. And I think this is part of the debate in California right now over the AI, the proposed AI. Actually, I haven't checked today what the status is, and I might be outdated, so forgive me. One of the questions that the California legislature was debating, that the governor was thinking about, is should we have sort of a, do no harm approach to innovation itself? And whatever that is, it isn't necessarily supportive of the innovation that, again, I think we all want. And this goes to how you structure a regulatory regime.
The problem with that is just thinking about impact. And so whenever I think about those kind of legislative approaches, or this also goes to just remedies in cases, when I teach, one of the examples of disruptive technology that I use is the containerization of maritime shipping. Right? So putting stuff in a box and then putting it on a ship and then taking it off the ship and putting it on a truck. Basically, if my recollection of the history of this industry is that it had got going through the 40s, but really the Korean War and the massive movement by DoD to move stuff to Korea was the kind of the catalyst for really ramping this up, such that by the early 60s, pretty much everything was moving in a box across the sea. Now, the reason I bring this up is that, a narrow view of the economics goes massive productivity increase, this is brilliant. But if you've walked down the west side of Manhattan, right, there are these neighborhoods called the Meatpacking District, Hell's Kitchen, and all these rotting, wooden wharves that you just see little pylons of. And, many of these neighborhoods were decimated by containerization when it all moved across to New Jersey, right? And so, and that led to 20, 30 years of social dislocation that changed the basic social geography of New York City. And, and this is sort of what I mean by, there's a lot of uncertainty and there's disruption inevitably with innovation. And if a particular interest group is able to capture a legislature, say, in California, heaven forbid, and something that probably we would agree was, at least in the long term, socially beneficial in a very broad way, but had a unambiguously negative impact on a reasonably sized subpopulation of that could be just as harmful as shutting down that innovation to protect the longshoremen in Hell's Kitchen is probably not the social outcome we want. And so it's, while there's some sort of attraction to having additional regulatory oversight, I also see that the threat of capture as one of the things that makes me deeply uncomfortable about this. And I kind of like, juries and judges, because at least you're not getting the same jury and judge every single time you have to make a decision.
Well, I also think one way to look at the Digital Markets Act, and I think if you look at and probably talk to most people at the European Commission and even in the European Parliament, what they would say is the Digital Markets Act arose out of a frustration with how long that process takes, how long it takes to get to judges and juries, and the fact that from their perspective, there was significant competitive harm happening during that period of time. And so while you see these massive judgments against all of the tech companies and significant consent decrees in Europe, the Digital Markets Act in many ways codified some of those major cases, right? It's codifying Google Shopping, it's codifying Amazon and competitive data use, it's codifying the FCO's case against Meta in Article 5.2. So I think in many ways they would argue that this is the answer to the problem that I keep raising, which is, law takes a while. And it takes a while to develop. And by the time these cases wind through, is it already no longer the same technological problem? Again, I think those would be the views of the Europeans. They're not my personal views. I, like John, like judges and juries. But I also think there's a certain amount of hubris associated with that in terms of feeling like you truly understand these really complex markets and products in a way that makes it easier for you to grapple with them. And I think you can, a good example of that already is you hear the conversation going on around, well, is Digital Markets Act sufficient to regulate AI? Or do we need an entirely new regulatory regime in order to do that? And I think that is a very live conversation in Europe right now.
To me, oh, sorry.
We have 5 minutes. I did want to, I want to at least offer time for some questions. Or we can just bring lunch up here and keep talking.
I'll give you a question. So great panel, thank you. It seems like there's a ton of agreement on this panel about competition and innovation being virtues. But I suspect they're under the surface. Maybe it wasn't completely under the surface. There may be divergence. I heard some evidence of divergence on how to identify particular transactions or conduct that we want to stop, prohibit, discourage in pursuit of these bigger virtues. I suspect, and I don't want to put words in John's mouth, I've tried to do that before and it never worked, that his metric or analysis would be something close to a focus on predictable economic welfare effects. You can push back on that if you
Well,
want.
I am an economist, David.
There you go. And whereas, and I think all this, by the way, this question really bears on something else that there was agreement on, explicit agreement on, about humility versus hubris. But I suspect those things might point in different directions for different people on the panel. And so I also heard you, Eric, say you may be focused on competition for competition's sake. And that made some hairs stand up on my neck about small, large numbers of individual competitors as a value intrinsic to the process, rather than looking at the predictable market effects or predictable economic effects or welfare effects, however you want to describe it. So I'm curious, Eric, if you could start with answering this question by articulating how you think this focus on competition for competition's sake bears on decision making.
Sure. So I would say, with lots of respect for the economists on the panel and economists generally, that the humility goes both ways. And so sometimes you may be able to put together an economic model that either shows no competitive harm or maybe it does show competitive harm, but it's hard to reconcile that with the real on-the-ground evidence of here are two firms that are obviously competing with each other, and there are several important competitive stories between them. A meaningful competition, let's say direct head-to-head competition, where maybe there are 3 or 4 players in the market, but player 3 and 4 aren't part of this very important conversation and it's important competition. And so I'm not saying that economics plays no role in that, but I think there is an intersection between economic theory and practical evidence of what you're seeing. And to the point that was made before, at the end of the day, if you want to talk about measurable effects, I think you can measure effects in lots of different ways. It doesn't always have to be measurable price effects. You can think about, there are cases that the agencies have been successful on that weren't simply about measurable price effects. In terms of, I think the natural and obvious question that you or certainly others on the panel would ask is, well, how much competition, right? How much of that head-to-head competition are you worried about?
The presumption word comes into this too, I think.
Sure. So I think, that answer is going to vary on a case-by-case basis. And at the end of the day, if a plaintiff brings a case because they're worried about that kind of competition, they're going to have to be able to persuade a judge that this competition is substantial and that there may be a lessening of it. And so I think that's where the rubber's going to meet the road, whether they do that through economic models or other practical evidence. On this point, I'm almost certain there is disagreement.
and I can vouch for that. Thank you.
Feel free.
Go ahead, Noah.
I'd add an additional thought. I'm sure there is disagreement on this panel. One of the problems that I think we face is that what people will view as observable effects may read very differently based on the person. So let me give an example. You, Katie, brought up the issue of data harms and like privacy and targeting. Right? We hear a lot about the social harms that come from some of these technologies, even technologies that lead to massive scale of firms, maybe a monopoly, who knows. One of the reasons that those products are popular is that people really like them. And it's very easy to say, if we had competition, you would have had better privacy, right? Or if we had more privacy, then firms won't be free to do all these bad things and we'll get more competition from privacy-friendly firms. But that's certainly not what the market's bearing out. Maybe the market is not bearing the thing out because there's an impediment to competition. Or maybe we just have nirvana fallacies about how consumers in particular in the aggregate behave or what ads they want to see. Maybe it's even bad for them that they see the ads or bad for the kids that they use social media. But for purposes of antitrust policy, leaving aside some other regulatory regime we might adopt, the question is really just competition. And I do think there is perhaps too much of a dose of, again, a nirvana fallacy of like, Well, the reason the thing is bad, the reason the wages are not high enough, the reason there isn't enough privacy protection, you name the issue, is because of an absence of competition. And one of the issues with moving away from the economic analysis is it lends itself too much to like ideating, as opposed to having confidence that what you're seeing is actually a competitive harm, as opposed to, say, just like a bad social outcome generated by market forces.
And we are over time. We are breaking for lunch, so folks can talk to the panelists over lunch about any thoughts you have. But thanks so much. I think a lot of fun.